Ridgway, a picturesque town nestled in the rolling hills of Vermont, had always been the type of place where nothing bad ever happened. At least, that's what its residents like to believe. With its charming Victorian homes, tree-lined streets, and close-knit community, Ridgway seemed almost immune to the troubles of the world outside. The Sinclairs were one of Ridgway's most beloved families. Allison and Mark Sinclair had built a life that many envied. Mark was a successful dentist with a thriving practice, while Allison managed their household and volunteered at local charities, known for her warm smile and nurturing presence. To everyone who knew them, Allison and Mark had it all: a beautiful home, 2 bright children, and a marriage that seemed as solid as a rock. But beneath the surface, dark secrets festered. Allison and Mark's life was far from perfect, and the story that would unfold in Ridgway would shock the town to its very core. Allison and Mark had been married for nearly 2 decades. They were high school sweethearts who had tied the knot right after college. Their love story had been the stuff of fairy tales, or at least it had seemed that way from the outside. But as the years went on, the pressures of life began to strain their relationship. Mark, always the workaholic, spent more and more time at his dental practice, leaving Allison to manage their children, Emma and Jacob, and the household on her own. Allison had given up her career in nursing to support Mark's ambitions and raise their children, a decision she began to resent as the years passed. The once passionate love they had shared had been replaced by cold, distant conversations about bills, school schedules, and social obligations. The cracks in their marriage, once barely noticeable, began to widen. Mark's long hours weren't just about work, though. Unknown to Allison, Mark had been having an affair with one of his dental assistants, a young woman named Rachel who was nearly half his age. The affair had started innocently enough: flirtatious banter during lunch breaks, stolen glances across the office, but it had quickly escalated into a full-blown relationship. Rachel, smitten with Mark's wealth and status, began to pressure him to leave Allison and start a new life with her. Mark, however, was reluctant to upend his family's life, knowing the fallout would be disastrous. Allison, who had always trusted her husband implicitly, began to sense that something was amiss. Mark had become increasingly distant, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something from her. She tried to confront him on several occasions, but Mark always brushed off her concerns, blaming his behavior on stress from work. One afternoon, while Mark was at work, Allison decided to clean out the drawers in his home office. As she sifted through papers and files, she stumbled upon a series of text messages on Mark's tablet. Her heart sank as she read the intimate conversations between Mark and Rachel. There was no mistaking the nature of their relationship. Allison's world collapsed in an instant. The man she had loved for over 20 years, the father of her children, had been betraying her. For days, Allison said nothing. She was too stunned, too heartbroken to confront Mark. But the more she thought about it, the more her pain turned to anger. She had sacrificed so much for him, given up her career, her independence, and now he had repaid her with infidelity. Allison knew she couldn't let this go. She had to do something, anything, to regain control of her life. As Allison struggled to come to terms with Mark's betrayal, she began to spiral into a dark obsession. She started tracking Mark's movements, reading through his emails, checking his phone logs, anything to confirm what she already knew. It wasn't long before Allison discovered that Mark had continued seeing Rachel even after she had found out about the affair. It was the final straw. Allison's mind began to unravel as she obsessed over Mark and Rachel's relationship. She started fantasizing about confronting Rachel, about making her pay for destroying her family. Those fantasies soon took a darker turn. Allison didn't just want Rachel to suffer, she wanted her gone. One night, Allison drove to Rachel's apartment, parking a few streets away so she wouldn't be seen. She sat in her car, watching the building from a distance, her thoughts racing. What would happen if she went inside? What if she confronted Rachel? What if she did something worse? The thought both terrified and excited her. But Allison didn't go inside that night. She drove home, shaken by the realization of how close she had come to doing something she could never take back. Still, the seed had been planted. The darkness that had taken root in her mind was growing, and soon it would consume her entirely. A few weeks later, Allison finally confronted Mark about the affair. It was late at night, the kids were asleep, and the house was eerily quiet. Allison had been waiting for the right moment, and now it had arrived. She cornered Mark in the living room, the dam of her pent-up emotions finally breaking. "How long have you been lying to me, Mark?" Allison's voice trembled with rage. Mark, caught off guard, tried to deny it at first, but Allison had all the evidence. She had the texts, the emails, the phone records. There was no way out for him. "Is it Rachel? Is she worth throwing everything away?" Allison's voice cracked as tears welled up in her eyes. Mark, realizing there was no use in lying anymore, confessed. He admitted to the affair, but in a desperate attempt to salvage the situation, he swore it was over, that he had made a terrible mistake, and that he loved Allison. But it was too late. Allison wasn't interested in his apologies. The betrayal had cut too deep. She stormed out of the room, leaving Mark to ponder the wreckage of their marriage. In the days that followed, Allison's anger only grew. She couldn't stop thinking about Rachel, about how she had stolen her husband, her life, her happiness. Allison began to fantasize again about confronting Rachel, but this time she didn't want to stop herself. She wanted revenge. Allison spent hours online, researching ways to make Rachel disappear without a trace. She read about poisons, methods of disposal, anything that could help her carry out her plan. She became consumed by the idea of erasing Rachel from existence. The more she thought about it, the more it made sense. If Rachel was gone, everything could go back to the way it was. Mark would realize his mistake, and they could rebuild their life together. It was a twisted logic, but in Allison's mind, it was the only way forward. One evening, while Mark was away on a work trip, Allison put her plan into motion. She called Rachel, pretending to be a friend of Mark's who wanted to talk about his dental practice. Rachel, unsuspecting, agreed to meet her at a local cafe. Allison arrived early, her heart racing as she waited for Rachel to show up. When Rachel walked through the door, Allison's anger surged. Here she was, the woman who had destroyed her life, sitting across from her like it was nothing. Allison could barely contain her rage, but she kept her composure. She had a plan, and she needed to stick to it. Allison invited Rachel back to her house, under the pretense of showing her some documents related to Mark's business. Rachel, still clueless, agreed. Once they were inside, Allison offered Rachel a drink, lacing it with a powerful sedative she had procured online. Within minutes, Rachel was unconscious, slumped over on the couch. Allison stood over her, the weight of what she had done beginning to sink in. But it wasn't over yet. Allison dragged Rachel's unconscious body to the basement, where she had prepared a makeshift cleanup station. She had plastic sheets, duct tape, and a sharp kitchen knife, tools she had bought in a fevered haze of determination. She had thought about this moment for weeks, but now that it was here, her hands shook, her mind racing with doubt. Could she really go through with it? But the sight of Rachel, the woman who had stolen her husband, filled her with a cold, calculated rage. She couldn't back down now. This was her only way out. With trembling hands, Allison raised the knife. When it was over, Allison sat in the basement, covered in blood, staring at the lifeless body of Rachel. The reality of what she had done was overwhelming. There was no turning back now. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The next few days were a blur for Allison. She went through the motions of normal life, taking the kids to school, attending charity events, smiling for the neighbors. But inside, she was unraveling. She had disposed of Rachel's body in a remote forest, burying it deep in the ground. But she couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart. And she was right. When Rachel failed to show up for work, her disappearance was quickly reported to the police. Mark, unaware of Allison's involvement, was questioned as part of the investigation, but he had no answers. As the days turned into weeks, the police began to suspect foul play. Allison, once the perfect housewife, now lived in constant fear. Every knock on the door, every phone call, felt like the moment her secret would be exposed. As the weeks dragged on, the investigation into Rachel's disappearance intensified. Ridgeway, once a town immune to tragedy, became gripped by fear and suspicion. The police scoured through Rachel's phone records, social media accounts, and interviewed her friends and co-workers. Mark, despite his affair, was cooperative with the investigation, but his distress over Rachel's disappearance was becoming more difficult to hide. He was constantly on edge, barely able to function under the weight of guilt. Allison, on the other hand, tried her best to maintain a facade of normalcy, even as the walls were closing in on her. The tension in the Sinclair household was palpable. Mark and Allison hardly spoke, and when they did, it was clipped, emotionless exchanges about the children or mundane household tasks. Mark was buried in guilt, unsure if Rachel had left of her own accord or if something more sinister had happened to her. He could feel the police growing suspicious, and the pressure was suffocating. Allison, however, had an even more harrowing burden. While Mark suspected Rachel had simply run away or been harmed by someone else, Allison knew the truth. The gruesome memory of that night in the basement played on a loop in her mind. She struggled to sleep, often waking up in a cold sweat, certain she would hear the sound of the police sirens outside her home. Every time Mark mentioned Rachel's name or the ongoing investigation, Allison's heart raced, her hands trembling as she gripped her coffee cup a little too tightly. But she couldn't break, not now. She had to keep her composure for her children's sake, and to keep the life she had tried so desperately to protect. Yet her paranoia began to grow. She constantly checked the news for any mention of a body being found. She frequently drove by the remote area where she had buried Rachel, ensuring that the earth hadn't been disturbed. Allison knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light, and she started to prepare herself for the inevitable collapse. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when everything unraveled. The Sinclair family had gathered for a tense meal at home when there was a knock at the door. Allison froze, her mind racing as she wondered if this was the moment she had been dreading. Mark got up to answer the door, and moments later, 2 police officers stepped into the living room. "Allison Sinclair?" one of the officers asked. Allison's stomach dropped. Her hands trembled as she nodded. "We'd like to ask you a few questions down at the station regarding Rachel Holmes." Mark's face turned pale, and for a moment there was nothing but stunned silence. Allison felt her heart slam against her chest. Her worst fears had come true. At the police station, the interrogation room was cold and sterile. Allison sat across from 2 detectives, her nerves frayed, her composure slipping. They asked her questions about her relationship with Rachel, her husband's affair, and what she knew about the night Rachel disappeared. Allison stuck to the story she had rehearsed in her head. She had never met Rachel. She knew about the affair but had no reason to harm her, and she had spent the night of Rachel's disappearance at home with the children. But the detectives were relentless. They had been investigating for weeks and had gathered evidence that suggested something more was at play. Rachel had told friends about receiving threatening messages from an unknown number, a number that the police had traced back to a burner phone purchased in Ridgeway. Allison's name had also come up in conversations with Mark's co-workers, who had noticed Allison's increasingly erratic behavior in the weeks leading up to Rachel's disappearance. "We know you didn't like Rachel, Mrs. Sinclair," one of the detectives said, his voice calm but firm. "We know you were angry about the affair. What we want to know is, how far did you go to get revenge?" Allison's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the walls closing in around her, the pressure mounting. But she wasn't ready to break, not yet. She denied everything, insisting that she had nothing to do with Rachel's disappearance. The detectives weren't satisfied, but they had no solid proof. Not yet. As the investigation continued, the police kept a close eye on Allison. They began to surveil her, monitoring her movements, waiting for her to slip up. The pressure of being constantly watched began to take its toll on Allison. She became paranoid, convinced that the police were following her everywhere. She avoided going out unless absolutely necessary, and even then, she was constantly looking over her shoulder. Mark, meanwhile, had grown distant. He was consumed with guilt over his affair, and his relationship with Allison had deteriorated to the point where they were little more than strangers living under the same roof. He had no idea what Allison had done, but he could sense that something was terribly wrong. The once strong, confident woman he had married was now a shell of her former self, haunted by a secret she refused to share. Then, one fateful day, the police got the break they had been waiting for. A hiker, wandering through the remote forest near Ridgeway, stumbled upon a shallow grave. Inside, they found Rachel's decomposing body, wrapped in plastic sheets and buried hastily. The discovery sent shockwaves through Ridgeway. The town that had prided itself on being safe and idyllic was now the epicenter of a gruesome murder investigation. The police quickly connected the discovery to Rachel's disappearance. The location of the grave was not far from where Allison had been spotted driving on several occasions, and forensic evidence at the scene. Tire tracks, fibers, and soil samples linked the crime back to her. The noose was tightening around Allison's neck. When the police arrived at the Sinclair home with a warrant for Allison's arrest, she knew it was over. There was no more running, no more hiding. She was handcuffed in front of her children, who watched in stunned silence as their mother was taken away. At the police station, Allison sat in the interrogation room, her hands shaking, her mind racing. She had thought she could get away with it, that she could bury her secret and move on with her life. But now, with the weight of her crime bearing down on her, she couldn't hold it in any longer. Through sobs and tears, Allison confessed to everything. She told the detectives about the affair, the rage and betrayal she had felt, and the dark obsession that had consumed her in the weeks leading up to Rachel's murder. She explained how she had lured Rachel to her home, drugged her, and killed her in a fit of uncontrollable rage. She recounted how she had buried Rachel's body in the forest, hoping that it would never be found. As Allison finished her confession, she broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably. The detectives watched in silence, knowing that they had finally cracked the case. Allison Sinclair was charged with first-degree murder. Her trial was a media spectacle, drawing attention from across the country. The once beloved housewife and mother was now portrayed as a cold-blooded killer, consumed by jealousy and rage. Mark, devastated by the loss of both his wife and his lover, filed for divorce and moved away from Ridgeway with their children. The idyllic life they had once shared was shattered beyond repair. Allison was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She would spend the rest of her days behind bars, haunted by the choices she had made and the life she had destroyed. Ridgway, too, would never be the same. The town that had once been a haven of peace and tranquility was now forever tainted by the dark secrets that had unfolded within its borders. In the end, no one emerged unscathed. Allison had lost everything: her family, her freedom, and her sanity. Mark was left to pick up the pieces of his broken life, forever haunted by the consequences of his infidelity. And Rachel, the young woman caught in the middle of a deadly love triangle, had paid the ultimate price. The story of Allison and Mark Sinclair serves as a chilling reminder of how love, betrayal, and revenge can intertwine to create a deadly chain of events. What began as a seemingly perfect life in a seemingly perfect town ended in tragedy, leaving behind a trail of broken lives and shattered dreams. In Ridgway, Vermont, the scars of that fateful night would never heal.